I was wearing my wedding ring the first time I realized I had feelings for someone who was not my husband. I remember looking down at it, that simple gold band that Owen had slid onto my finger in front of everyone we loved, and feeling, in the same moment, both the full weight of what it meant and the terrifying awareness that I was standing in a hospital corridor, heart beating faster than it should have been, waiting for a man who was not my husband to come back from the coffee machine. I did not take the ring off. Not that day. But something shifted in me in that corridor, quietly and without permission, and nothing that followed was ever quite the same. What would you have done if you were in my place? I have asked myself that question so many times that it has almost stopped meaning anything. But I'm asking you now, genuinely. Before you settle into a verdict about who I am and what I did, I want you to sit inside the complexity of this with me for a few minutes. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this story is not about a woman who stopped loving her husband. It is about a woman who loved her husband and fell for someone else simultaneously, and who did not handle that with the honesty either of them deserved. My name is Clara. I was 27 when my marriage began to fracture, not from the outside, not through any dramatic event, but from a slow internal erosion that I didn't have the language to describe until it was already too late to stop. Owen and I had been married for 2 years when it happened. We had been together for 4 before that, 6 years total, which meant we had been each other's primary person through our entire adult formation. He knew me before I knew myself, in some ways. He had seen me through my first real job and my first real failure, and the death of my grandmother, and every awkward in-between year of my mid-20s. We had a history that was woven into the fabric of who I was. Leaving it, even in imagination, felt like dismantling something structural. But I want to be honest about what our marriage had become by year 2. Not bad, I need to emphasize that. Owen was not unkind, not unfaithful, not neglectful in any obvious way. But we had fallen into a rhythm that had slowly, incrementally become more routine than relationship. We ate the same meals on the same nights. We watched the same shows. We went to bed at the same time, lay in the same positions, and the conversations we had were largely logistical. Bills, schedules, grocery lists, weekend plans. The stuff of a shared life, without much of the stuff that had made us want to share it in the first place. I had tried to name it. I feel like we've become very domestic, I said one Sunday morning, sitting across from Owen over coffee. Like we're really good at running the household, but we've stopped being really good at being with each other. He looked up from his phone. What does that mean exactly? I mean, when did we last talk about something that actually mattered? Something that wasn't logistics. He thought about it. We talked about your sister's situation last week. That's not what I mean, and I think you know it. He put his phone down. Clara, I'm here, I'm present. I don't know what more you want me to do. That sentence, I'm here, I'm present, as though physical proximity was the full definition of connection. I sat with my coffee, and I felt the gap between us more clearly than I had ever felt it, and I didn't know how to cross it, and I'm not sure he saw it clearly enough to try. I worked as a hospital administrator. I had been in the role for 3 years, and it was a job I found meaningful but demanding, and the environment of a hospital, the intensity of it, the proximity of high stakes and high emotion, had always been something that felt significant to me. People showed up there at their most stripped down, their most honest. The performance of ordinary life didn't have much space in a hospital corridor. His name was Seb, Dr. Sebastian Farrow, though no one called him that except patients and the formal structures of institutional life. He was a registrar, 31, and he had transferred to our hospital from one in another city 8 months before we properly met. I had seen him in passing before that, brief intersections in corridors, the functional acknowledgments of 2 people who work in the same building and occasionally need things from each other. He had a quality about him that I noticed without examining, a particular kind of calm in difficult situations, the composure of someone who had learned to inhabit crisis without being undone by it. We were properly introduced at a staff meeting in January. He was seated across the table, and when we were introduced, he looked at me with the kind of directness that is neither aggressive nor flirtatious, but simply present, and said, Clara, I've heard good things about how you run the administrative side of things here. Simple, professional. And yet something about being seen, specifically and warmly, by someone who didn't have to see me at all, it landed somewhere. Nothing happened for weeks after that. We crossed paths in the way that colleagues do, brief conversations in passing. The occasional shared frustration about institutional bureaucracy, which in a hospital is endless and consuming and provides ample material for the kind of commiserating that builds familiarity without seeming to. I told myself, for a long time, that what I felt in his presence was simply the relief of easy professional rapport. That I liked him the way you like a colleague, who makes your working environment feel lighter. I was wrong about that, but I allowed myself to be wrong about it for long enough that the feeling put down roots before I acknowledged it was growing. The first real line, the first moment where I should have stepped back and didn't, was a Thursday evening in March. A difficult situation at work had run long, and most of the staff had gone home, and Seb and I were both still there, finishing separate things, and he came to find me to ask about a patient file, and somehow the conversation about the file became a conversation about the day, and the day became a conversation about the specific difficulty of caring about a job that regularly breaks your heart. "How do you not take it home?" I asked. We were standing in the corridor outside my office, the building mostly empty around us. "The cases that don't go the way they should, how do you leave them here?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't always. I've gotten better at it. But I think the honest answer is that you don't stop caring, you just get better at carrying it." I looked at him. That's a lonelier answer than I was hoping for. He smiled, not a big smile, just a slight shift in his expression, the kind that feels more honest than a full grin. "Most true things are." I drove home that evening, and I sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. Not because anything had happened, because something had been said that felt more real than most of what I had been saying to Owen for months, and the contrast was something I couldn't quite put back where it had been. I told Owen about the conversation at dinner. Not all of it. I gave him the version that was professional and unremarkable, the colleague chat about work stress. I left out the part that felt like more. That omission, small, seemingly harmless, was the first brick. I have learned to look at the bricks now, to see them for what they are when they appear. Then I looked away. The texts began in April. His number had been in my phone for professional reasons for months, and the first few exchanges were work-related: scheduling, a patient query, a form that needed administrative sign-off. But professional texting has a particular tone, a particular brevity, and somewhere in April that brevity began to soften. A work text that ended with a sentence that wasn't about work. A reply that asked a question that had nothing to do with the original subject. The slow migration from functional to personal that happens when two people are paying attention to each other, and neither of them is creating resistance. I knew, I want to be honest about that. I knew what was happening, in the way that you know something your stomach registers before your mind will fully admit. And I kept going, small choice by small choice, because each individual step felt containable, felt like something that could be walked back if necessary, felt like nothing definitive had yet occurred. Owen and I had an argument in May that I think broke something fragile that had been holding. Not a dramatic argument, nothing thrown, nothing irretrievable said. Just an argument about something small that had the particular exhausting quality of arguments that are really about something much larger, where you're both circling the real thing and fighting about the surface thing, because the real thing feels too big to aim at directly. "You're not here lately," Owen said, in the middle of it. "Even when you're physically here, you're not here." "I don't know what that means," I said, defensive, buying time. "Yes, you do," he said, quiet, certain. "I don't know what it is, but something is different." I could have told him then. That moment, that exact, awful moment where he was standing in front of me with enough awareness to see the gap and enough love to name it, was the moment I should have been honest. About what I was feeling, about who I had been texting, about the corridor and the driveway and all the small moments of leaning I had been allowing. Instead I said, "I'm just tired. It's a hard season at work." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, and let it go, because he trusted me, and trusting me meant accepting the explanation I gave him. I have never stopped being sorry for that specificity. See moment. What happened in June I will not describe in detail, because the detail isn't the point, and because the person who deserves the most protection in this story is Owen. What I will say is that a line was crossed that I had been approaching for months, and I crossed it with awareness and without enough resistance, and that night changed the nature of everything that came before it and everything that came after. In the weeks that followed, I inhabited a double life with a thoroughness that I am not proud of. I maintained the surface of my marriage with care, not because I was calculating, but because I genuinely loved Owen, and the love and the guilt and the confusion all existed simultaneously, which is perhaps the most psychologically honest thing I can say about this period. I was not a woman who had decided to leave. I was a woman who had done something irrevocable and did not know what to do with it, and so I did nothing and let time move, and told myself that resolution would arrive eventually on its own. It did not arrive on its own. It arrived the way unwanted truths generally arrive, through someone else's decision to be honest. Seb ended it. In July, 2 months after everything had shifted, he came to me and said the thing I had not been able to say to myself. "This isn't right," he said. We were in a quiet corner of the hospital grounds, a bench near the car park, the least cinematic location imaginable. I've been telling myself it's complicated, and it is, but complicated doesn't change what it is. And what it is wrong. You're married, Clara, and you're a good person doing a bad thing, and I'm a bad person who let it happen, and neither of us is being fair to your husband. I sat with that for a moment. "I know," I said. "Then you have to decide something. I'm not able to keep being the thing you haven't decided about." I drove home that evening, and I sat in the driveway of my house, the same driveway where I had sat in March, the beginning of all of it, and I understood that I had arrived at the moment I had been avoiding, the moment where the managing had to stop and the choosing had to begin. I told Owen that night. He was in the kitchen when I came in, doing something ordinary, making tea, I think, or washing something, one of those familiar domestic motions that make up the texture of a shared life. I asked him to sit down. He looked at my face, and whatever he saw in it made him go very still before I had said a word. I told him, simply and completely, and without the defensive framing I had been carrying internally, not the version where I was emotionally starved and driven to it, the version where I had felt things and made choices and had not come to him when I should have, all of it. He was quiet throughout. When I finished, he stood up from the table, walked to the window, and stood with his back to me for a long time. When he turned around, his face had a quality I had never seen in 6 years of knowing him, something that had moved past shock into a deep, settled devastation. "How long did you know?" he said. Not a question, more like a reckoning. "Since January," I said. "I knew something was building since January." "January," he repeated. And I watched him do the math, 5 months of our shared life that I had been carrying something he had no knowledge of. 5 months of breakfasts and Sunday mornings and arguments about nothing, all of it occurring while I held something he had every right to know. He asked me to leave that night. Not permanently, he didn't say that. He said he needed time and space, and he needed them to begin immediately. I went to my sisters, who asked no questions that first night, and gave me a room and a glass of water and sat with me in silence in a way I will never stop being grateful for. The secondary turn, the thing I had not prepared for, came 3 days later when Owen called me, not to continue the conversation I expected, but to tell me something that reframed everything. He told me that he had been aware, for longer than he had let on, that something was wrong between us. Not the specifics, not Seb, not the extent of it, but the gap, the distance, the way I had been not quite present for months. And he told me that he had been afraid to press on it because he was afraid of what he would find. And that fear, his choice to protect himself from the truth, had been its own kind of absence, its own choice to look away from something he should have moved toward. "I'm not saying that to excuse what you did," he said. "I'm saying it because if we're going to have an honest conversation about what happened, it has to be actually honest, from both sides." I don't know that I've ever loved Owen more than I did in that moment. His willingness to look at his own part in the erosion, in the middle of being the one who had been wronged, was a generosity I had not earned and did not deserve. We went to couples therapy, 6 months of it weekly, in a small office with a therapist who did not let either of us off easy. We learned things about each other and ourselves that 6 years of relationship had somehow not required us to learn. We learned what we had each been not saying and why. We learned what assumptions we had each been carrying unchecked. We learned the specific and difficult work of turning toward each other under pressure rather than managing and concealing. We are still married. I want to say that clearly because I think this story, told in full, has earned that truth. We are still married, and we are different than we were, not easier, not unmarked by what happened, but more honest and more intentional and more genuinely present with each other than we had been in years. Owen chose, after everything, to stay. That choice is not something I have normalized or taken for granted. It is something I think about with a specific, sustained gratitude that I'm not sure I would have been capable of before all of this broke us open. What I want to leave you with is not a redemption arc neatly tied. It is something simpler and harder than that. The moment in the corridor, the wedding ring, the faster heartbeat, the awareness of something beginning, that moment had a different possible ending. I could have gone home that evening and said to Owen, I need us to talk. Really talk. I think something is happening in me that is a signal about something between us, and I need us to look at it together. That conversation existed. It was available, and it would have been frightening and vulnerable and enormously difficult, and it would have been the right thing. I chose the wrong door. I walked through it for months while wearing my wedding ring, while sleeping next to a man who trusted me, while telling myself the story that made each choice feel small enough to survive. The ring means something, not because it is a symbol of perfection, not because wearing it makes you immune to feeling, not because falling for someone else is impossible once it's on your finger. It means that when you feel something that threatens what it represents, you owe the person who put it there the truth, before it becomes a choice, before it becomes a secret, before the corridor becomes months of carefully managed deception. I know that now. I learned it the hardest possible way, and I am still learning what it means to be genuinely present in a relationship rather than present in the way that occupies space while keeping secrets. If you are somewhere in this story, if any room of it feels familiar, please choose the honest conversation. Not because it is easy, because it is the only version of this that doesn't cost everyone everything. Leave a comment, tell me where you are with it, and I will see you in the next one.